You are not who you think you are, not because something is wrong with you, not because you have been living a lie, but because the version of you that you have been calling yourself, the one built from every experience, every label, every wound, every expectation, every role you were handed before you were old enough to choose, that version is a construction. And constructions, no matter how solid they feel, are not the same as truth. The greatest identity shift of this century is not happening in the culture. It is not happening in politics or technology or the collapse of old institutions. It is happening in the interior of every human being sensitive enough to feel that the self they have been performing is no longer large enough to contain what they are becoming. You feel this. You have been feeling it. A restlessness that has no clean object. A tiredness that sleep does not fix. A quiet but persistent sense that the life built around the old identity, its habits, its relationships, its assumptions about what is possible, has started to feel like a room that is slightly too small. That feeling is not a symptom of something wrong. It is the first signal of the shift. Nor. This, and you will spend another year managing the discomfort without understanding its source. Another year defending an identity that is already in the process of releasing. Another year mistaking the pressure of becoming for the weight of failing, or you stay. You listen, and you begin to understand what the most precise science of the last century and the most ancient wisdom traditions of human history are pointing toward together. The self you have been is not finished with you, but it is finished being everything you are. In quantum mechanics, there is a principle that should have changed everything about how human beings understand identity, and largely did not, because it arrived in the language of physics rather than the language of the soul. It is called superposition. A particle, before it is observed, does not exist in one definite state. It exists in all of its possible states simultaneously, not metaphorically, not philosophically, mathematically, physically, measurably. All possibilities are real and present at the same time, occupying the same space, until the moment of observation collapses them into a single defined outcome. The act of observation is what creates the definite from the possible. Before the measurement, all versions are real. After the measurement, one version becomes the world. Now hold that. Because this is not only a description of subatomic particles, this is a precise description of the human identity at the moment of threshold, before the shift. All versions of who you could be are simultaneously real. The version still loyal to the old story. The version that has already stepped through. The version that is afraid. The version that is ready. The version built from other people's definitions. The version that has never yet been seen clearly. All of them are real. All of them are present. All of them occupy the same interior space. The question is not which version is true. The question is which version receives the force of your observation. Because what you observe, what you give the sustained, deliberate attention of your deepest awareness, that is what collapses from possibility into the life you are actually living. This is the most powerful thing quantum science has offered to the understanding of human transformation. Not a technique, not a practice. A principle. The observer does not merely witness what is already determined. The observer participates in determining what becomes real. You are the observer of your own identity, and you have been, in many cases, observing the old version so consistently, so automatically, so unquestioningly, that it has remained the one version that keeps collapsing into actuality. Not because it is the truest, but because it is the most observed. Anubis has been watching this process since before the first dynasty of Egypt, not as a metaphor, not as a decoration on a tomb wall, as a principle so fundamental to the inner life of the human being that the people who understood it most deeply gave it a face, a name, a form, and placed it at the threshold between what was and what becomes. The jackal head, the scales, the feather, every image precise, every detail functional. The jackal, because jackals live at the boundary between settlement and desert, between the known and the unknown, between the world of the living and the world of what comes next.
Anubis is the guardian of that boundary, not the boundary in the ground.
The boundary in the self, the scale, because the passage from one identity to the next requires a measurement, not a judgment in the moral sense.
A measurement in the physical sense. What you are carrying, is it light enough to move through the threshold?
Or has it accumulated the weight of 1,000 performances, 1,000 borrowed beliefs, 1,000 fears rehearsed so many times they have calcified into what feels like personality? The feather, because the standard is not perfection, it is not achievement. It is not spiritual advancement or emotional resolution or the completion of any inner work. The standard is the weight of a feather. The standard is, are you carrying yourself, or are you carrying everything you were told you had to be? Every time a human being has stood at the edge of a genuine identity shift, every time the old self has reached the limits of what it can contain, and the new self has not yet solidified, Anubis has been at that threshold, weighing, not to deny passage, to clarify what can be carried forward and what must be laid down. You are at that threshold now. Not because this message placed you there. You were already there when you found this. The message arrived because something in you recognized that the scales are present. And that recognition, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of the measurement. The century you are living in is unprecedented in one specific way that no previous era of human history has had to navigate. For the first time in recorded history, a human being can spend an entire lifetime surrounded by mirrors that confirm whatever identity they bring to them. Every algorithm, every platform, every curated feed of information and connection, designed to show you more of what you have already shown yourself to be. This is not neutral. This is the most powerful identity solidification technology ever built, and it runs in the background of every waking hour, quietly, continuously, presenting the old self with confirmation of itself, so constant and so seamless that the question of whether the old self is
Actually, who you are becomes almost
impossible to hear. The restlessness you feel is that question, insisting on being heard despite everything designed to prevent.
the sleep that does not
Restore you is the body signaling that it is spending its nights processing the weight of maintaining an identity that has grown heavier than it was designed to be. The relationships that feel slightly
off, not wrong exactly, not broken exactly,
but operating at a frequency that no longer matches
what you are becoming. Those
are the field around you responding to the shift that is already
underway in the interior. You are not imagining.
You are not being dramatic. You are not behind or broken or in crisis. You are in superposition, all versions of you simultaneously real. The old ones still visible, still functional, still producing the life you have built. The new one not yet collapsed into actuality, but present, genuine, already occupying the same interior space as everything else. The shift is not something that will happen to you. It is something that is happening and has been for longer than you have had language for it. The only question is whether you will become conscious of it before it completes itself without your participation. There is a specific kind of suffering that belongs only to the identity threshold. It is not the suffering of loss, though it can feel like grief. It is not the suffering of failure, though it can feel like inadequacy. It is not the suffering of confusion, though it can feel like lostness. It is the suffering of two versions of the self occupying the same body at the same time. The old self, still running its programs, still generating its habitual responses, still defending the boundaries it built to survive what it has already survived, trying to maintain coherence in a system that is changing beneath it. And the new self, not yet fully formed, not yet able to speak clearly in the language of the ordinary life, not yet able to point to itself and say, "Here I am, this is what I am," but present,
undeniably present.
pressing against the interior of the old identity from within. This double occupancy is exhausting, and it is almost universally misread. Most people, when they feel it, search for an external explanation. The relationship, the job, the city.
The circumstances.
They rearrange the outside of the life, hoping to relieve the pressure from within. And sometimes the rearrangement helps, briefly, because changing external circumstances can give the new self slightly more room. But it does not complete the shift, because the shift is not external. It is the collapse of a superposition. It is the moment when the sustained, deliberate observation of the new self, the conscious, repeated, chosen act of looking at who you are becoming rather than who you have been, begins to be more powerful than the automatic, habitual, unconscious observation of the old, and the new version begins, at last, to be what collapses into the life you are actually living. This is not instant. Nothing real is instant, but it is measurable. It is observable. And it begins with the exact kind of attention you are giving this message right now. Write this where you can return to it. Not in a moment. Now. In the comments below, if you are ready to mark the beginning. I am in the shift.
Not arriving. Already inside it, because you are.
You have been. And naming it is the first act of conscious observation. Breathe here. Just once, deliberately, not a spiritual performance.
A physical act.
The breath that says to the nervous system, I am here.
I am present.
I am choosing to observe what is actually happening, rather than what the old story says is happening. Feel the weight of the body.
Not as burden, as evidence.
You are here, in this specific life, in this specific moment of threshold, in this specific configuration of everything you have been and everything you are in the process of becoming. The old identity is not your enemy. This must be clear. The old self built what it could from what it had. It adapted to conditions that required specific shapes. Shapes that were intelligent, shapes that were functional, shapes that allowed you to navigate what you had to navigate. The child who learned to be small in order to be safe was not wrong to learn that. The adaptation was precisely correct for the conditions. The adult who is still running that adaptation in conditions that no longer require it, that is not failure. That is a program that was never updated because no one taught you that programs can be updated. You are here because something in you already knows that update is possible. Not easy.
Not instant.
Not without the discomfort of standing in the threshold while both versions of you occupy the same interior space, but possible.
Genuinely, measurably, physically possible, because consciousness changes the outcome of superposition.
Because the observer participates in determining what becomes real. Because you are not simply the character that has been written so far. You are also the one writing, and the pen has always been available. You simply had not been told it was yours. The ancient initiates of Kemet understood something about identity that modern psychology has only begun to articulate in clinical language. They called it the transformation of the Badaba. One of the 5 aspects of the soul in Egyptian cosmology was not the personality. It was not the ego. It was the unique, essential character of a person. I mean, the thing that made them irreducibly themselves beneath all the roles, all the adaptations, all the performances. The bar was what survived threshold, not unchanged, but continuous. The through line that ran from one version of the self to the next, carrying the essence without requiring the old form. The transformation of the bar was not death in the ordinary sense. It was the release of what had been housing the essential self, the old identity structure, the old personality configuration, the old set of survival adaptations, so that the essential self could move through the threshold and take a form more appropriate to what it was becoming. Anubis presided over this transformation, not as executioner but as midwife, not ending the old self, facilitating its release. The scales of Maat were not measuring whether the old self was worthy of continuation. They were measuring whether the old self had been held so tightly, so desperately, so rigidly, out of fear, out of unfamiliarity with threshold, out of the human tendency to mistake the container for the content, that the essential self could no longer move through. A heart heavier than a feather was not a condemned heart. It was a heart that had not yet learned to lay down what it did not need to carry. The feather was not the weight of perfection. It was the weight of self, just self. Without the accumulated mass of every performance, every inherited belief, every borrowed definition of who you were allowed to be. That is the measurement. That is what this century is asking every human being who has arrived at threshold to bring to the scales. Not a perfect life, not a resolved past, not a completed transformation, just are you carrying you? Or are you carrying everything you were told you had to be in order to be acceptable? Here is what the identity shift actually looks like.
Not from the outside.
From the inside, it does not look like a dramatic awakening. It does not look like sudden clarity that resolves everything.
It does not arrive as a single moment that changes all subsequent moments. It looks like a Tuesday when you notice yourself about to give the old response, the automatic.
Habitual identity-preserving response, and you pause, just for a second, just long enough to feel that the pause is possible. It looks like a conversation where you realize, mid-sentence, that you are performing a version of yourself that does not match what you actually think. And instead of finishing the performance, you stop. You say something slightly more true. It looks like standing in front of a decision that the old identity would make automatically. The safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that maintains the coherence of who you have been. And feeling, for the first time clearly, that there is another available response. Not necessarily better in any obvious sense, but more aligned, more true, more in the direction of what is actually forming inside you. It looks like this, small, incremental, almost invisible from the outside, and on the inside, seismic. Because each time the observer chooses to observe the new version instead of the old one, the superposition shifts fractionally. The new version becomes slightly more real. The old version loses fractionally of its total dominion over what collapses into actuality. And over time, not overnight, not without difficulty, not without the occasional full retreat into the old patterns followed by the return that is itself part of the process. Over time, a different life begins to be the one that is actually lived, not because the external circumstances forced it, because the observer changed, because you chose. Again and again, in the small and ordinary moments that make up the texture of a life, to collapse the superposition in a different direction. That is the shift. That is what this century is asking of you. That is what Anubis has been holding the scales for. There are those who will read this and feel the recognition, the sensation of something named that has been present but inarticulate, and then return to the life of the old identity because recognition, without action, does not produce collapse. The superposition does not shift because you understand it. It shifts because you observe differently. So here is the only practice this message offers.
Not a meditation, not a technique, not a system.
A single, repeatable act of observation. When you notice the old identity running, when you catch the automatic response, the habitual fear, the borrowed belief, the performance that does not match what is actually forming inside you, instead of fighting it, instead of analyzing it, instead of trying to replace it immediately with something better, observe it. Simply, clearly, without becoming it again. This is what I learned to do. This is what I am in the process of no longer needing to do. This is a pattern, not a truth. This is a construction, not a self. And then, without force, without urgency, without the pressure of needing to be somewhere other than exactly where you are, ask the question that the scales have always held. What would the version of me that is lighter than a feather do here?
Not the perfect version.
Not the fully transformed version. Not the version that has completed some spiritual curriculum and arrived at a permanent elevated state. The lighter version. The one carrying only what is genuinely its own. What would that version do here? And then, whether or not you can fully inhabit that version yet, let the answer inform even a fraction of what you do next. That fraction is the shift beginning. That fraction, repeated, is the superposition collapsing in a new direction. That fraction, accumulated over the days and weeks and months ahead, is the greatest identity shift of this century. Not as a cultural event, not as a collective phenomenon visible from the outside, but as the intimate, interior, irreversible reality of a person who decided, in small moments that no one else witnessed, to observe themselves differently. You are in superposition, all versions of you simultaneously real, all possibilities genuinely present. The old one and the new one and the one you cannot yet name occupying the same interior space, waiting for the force of your sustained attention to determine which one collapses into the life you are actually living. Anubis holds the scales. Not to judge you, to ask the only question that the threshold has ever held: what are you carrying?
And is it lighter than a feather?
Because if it is, if beneath everything you have performed and protected and preserved, there is a self that is genuinely, essentially, irreducibly yours, then the shift is not something you need to produce. It is something you need to stop preventing. The scales are present. The observation is yours. The collapse begins the moment you choose which version receives the force of your attention. That moment is now.